After much tugging and pulling, Win finally managed to help Martha get dressed, and they met down in the kitchen where Connor was serving up soups and sandwiches. At first, Win only picked at her food, but as Connor drew her out about school and her job at the store, Martha could see her beginning to relax a little. And when he finally did steer the talk back to the matter at hand, Martha couldn't help but marvel at his skillful subtlety. He stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dismal weather and gave a loud sigh. Well, if this rain doesn't get any worse, I might be able to get more of those shutters fixed today. Oh, and I boarded up that panel in your closet, too, Martha. I thought you did that. Martha started without thinking, and then caught the warning glance Connor tossed back over his shoulder. Win frowned, twirling her spoon idly in her soup. That's probably what caused the drafts, Connor went on. Made it so cold in that room and kept blowing the door open. Did you know that, Win? Martha picked up casually. That there's a secret door inside the closet in my old room? Win looked puzzled for a moment, as if she'd suddenly awoken in a full room full of strangers, and then a light slowly began to dawn in her eyes. Of course I know about it, only I hadn't thought about it all this time. There's supposed to be lots of secret tunnels and things in the house. Elizabeth's father said he'd heard stories about them since he was a little boy, but he only knew about a few. Martha felt her pulse quicken, but Connor remained maddeningly calm. Do you know where they are? For a split second, Win looked blank, but then she nodded slowly. We weren't allowed to use them. They were so old, and Mr. Bedford was afraid we'd get hurt. In fact, he boarded up the one in Elizabeth's room, but what? She looked almost embarrassed. Elizabeth tore it down so Dennis could use it. No fool, Dennis? Connor murmured. Louder, he said, was Dennis the only other one who knew about the passage? Win glanced away uncomfortably, and Blake? Martha exclaimed. Yes, when he and Elizabeth started going out, she told him about them. You're sure about that? Connor said. That's what she said, Win insisted. There was one that went from the cellar to the study, and one that went from the attic to the pantry. Were there any that led outside? Again, Win looked blank. I don't know. Another way someone could get into the house? Win shook her head, close to tears. I don't know. Connor put a hand on her shoulder. It's okay, he said softly. Take it easy. You're doing fine. I'm not, Win said hopelessly. Oh, if I could only. Okay, Connor said soothingly. Don't try so hard. Just relax. His voice was lulling, hypnotic. Tomorrow's Halloween, but let's go back. Halloween night a year ago. Can you see it? Is it too painful? I don't think so. I'll try. Win glanced nervously at Martha, who nodded encouragement. Then she stared down at the table, her voice hesitant and shaking. We all went to the party at school that night. Elizabeth was really mad because she had gotten another phone call. She said that she'd had it with Dennis and his immature attitude, and she was going to do what she wanted. Blake was mad too, hoping Dennis would be there so he could let him have it once and for all. But none of them were really taking it seriously. They weren't scared or anything. They just wanted to party and have a good time. So you were all there? Yes. You really don't have to have a date or anything, but Blake and Elizabeth kind of made themselves scarce. Martha tried to ignore the implication as Win shot her an apologetic look. We were supposed to unmask at midnight, Win went on. Wait a minute, Connor stopped her. It was a costume party? Yes, they have one every year. Connor leaned back against the counter, crossing his legs. So did anybody actually see Dennis come in? Did they recognize him? Win nodded. Yes, I did. He came up to me and asked if Elizabeth was there. And I said yes, that she was with Blake. What did he say to that? Not much, just looked really mad about it. He went off into the crowd, and I didn't see him again for a while. Then Elizabeth and Blake had a fight. About what? Dennis? Win thought a moment. I'm not sure, but Greg came up to me at the refreshment table and said Blake had stormed out of the gym. Alone? Win nodded. We weren't supposed to be wandering around outside, so Greg went to look for him. He was gone pretty long. In the meantime, I went to find Elizabeth, and I couldn't find her either. Did she leave too? It was so dark in there, so many people, everyone had on costumes, and so many of them looked alike. I looked and looked and looked for her for a long time, but I couldn't find her. What did you do then? I didn't know what to do. I was starting to get really scared. I finally went outside to find Greg, and that's when I saw them. Who? Elizabeth and Dennis. In Dennis's car. They were pulling out of the parking lot, and I yelled at them, and Elizabeth leaned out the window and said that they were only going to her house to talk and not to tell Blake because he'd be mad. She said they needed to get something straight, and then they'd be right back. So you covered for her? Win looked miserable. I lied to Greg. I told him Elizabeth had gotten sick and we were going to my house for a while. And he never suspected? Wynn shook her head slowly. The house was close by and he was still trying to find Blake. And he was supposed to be chaperoning too. Some of the guys got into a fight with the band and there was a big commotion. So he wasn't really thinking too much about Elizabeth and me. Then you went home? Wynn closed her eyes, took a deep breath. My folks were out that night, so I hung around for a while, and then I just went back to school and sat in Greg's car and waited for Elizabeth to come back. How long were you there? About an hour, I guess. I'm not sure. She raised her eyes, pressed her hand to her forehead, and then I saw Blake drive up in his car. He looked upset, and his clothes were all wet, and he just sat there for a long time like he was thinking. And Elizabeth still hadn't come back? No, finally Blake got out and went back into the gym, and I just didn't know what to do. I was really starting to panic by then. When I went in, Greg and Blake were waiting for me. I had to tell them the truth then, that she really wasn't with me. But she'd made me promise. Her voice faltered. I was so scared, so scared. Suddenly all the stuff we'd laughed at seemed so dangerous. So she'd been gone for more than an hour by then, Connor said? And where had Blake been? Wynn looked down at her hands, twisted them in her lap. He said he'd driven around for a while. Then he'd just gotten out of his car and walked. When he found out I had let Elizabeth go like that, he was furious. I've never seen him so mad. She covered her face with her hands and began to cry. Don't you understand how awful this is? I'm the one who saw them leave. I'm the one who saw them, and I didn't do anything. But you didn't know. Martha tried to comfort her. You couldn't have known. But she trusted me. She asked me to cover for her while she left with Dennis. She trusted me and I could have stopped her, and then she died. For a long while, there was only the sound of Wynn's sobs, the gloomy hiss of rain down the window, the whine of the wind around the eaves. Connor looked like a statue, his angular face caught in the soft glow of the kitchen light. He seemed to pull his thoughts together with an effort. What happened when you got here, he asked then. When you got here to the house. The sobs faded. From behind her hands, Wynn's voice was dull with pain. It took us a long time to get here. Blake was driving and we got a flat tire. The boys were yelling at each other. Blake was yelling at me. So you're finally at the house now. Connor reached down gently, raised Wynn from her chair. So what do you do now? Wynn hung back, her face ashen. Martha took one of her hands and gave her an encouraging smile. It's all right. We'll go through it with you. It can't hurt you with us here. You know that. Connor nodded. Martha could tell it was Connor who convinced Wynn at last. Wynn went slowly into the front hall. For several moments she stared at the heavy door, then lifted her chin determinedly. It was storming when we got here. Blake jumped out of the car before Greg even had it parked, and he started banging on the door and yelling. But the door was locked and there was only one light on. Back in Elizabeth's room, he just went crazy, beating and shouting, and Greg was trying to find a way in. She squeezed her eyes shut, squeezing the vision from the past. He broke one of the windows on the terrace. He put his hand through the glass and broke it, and we all got inside. Very slowly, almost as if she were drugged, Wynn took a step forward, another, and reached out for the banister. They were yelling at me to stay there. Blake was yelling at me not to go upstairs. Don't let her go up there, he kept saying, and Greg was trying to grab me, but I started running. I don't remember getting from the parlor to the stairs, but I did, and, go on, Connor said gently. It's all right. Wynn started up the staircase, her footsteps wooded and slow. Connor touched Martha on the elbow, and they followed. The light was on, but I couldn't see anyone. Wynn whispered, and I think I know I called her name. Martha's heart felt ready to burst. Every nerve warned her to turn and flee, but Connor's hand gripped hold of her arm. She looked at him, but his eyes were on Wynn. She didn't answer me, and it was so quiet, even though Greg and Blake were yelling, calling me to come back. Even with them shouting like that, it was just so quiet, and I kept saying her name, Elizabeth, Elizabeth, but she wouldn't answer. They had reached the second floor now. Wynn's hands went nervously to her throat, and Martha wondered if she was going to be sick. Connor, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Maybe we... Keep still, Martha, Connor whispered. And then what happened? He said more loudly to Wynn. I went into her room, Wynn said dully. After an uneasy pause, she moved forward until the three of them were squeezed into the door of Elizabeth's bedroom. Wynn stared ahead, and Martha could tell that whatever she saw was horrible. You're in her room now, Connor murmured. What do you see, Wynn? Wynn's eyes fell at once to the bed, and her face slowly began to drain. She's lying there. Her mouth is open, but I can't hear her screaming, and the room is so red and wet, and she doesn't look like Elizabeth anymore. Martha's eyes blurred. She felt Connor's hand tighten on her arm. His face was drawn, stony. Wynn started to turn back to where they were standing, and then her eyes passed over the open closet. Martha saw her stiffen and knew at once that something was wrong. Connor must have sensed it even sooner. She felt him turn loose of her as he started across the floor towards Wynn. What is it? Connor demanded. What do you see? And Wynn fell back, clutching at him, her eyes wide, her words tumbling out in a helpless sort of babble. The dark! The dark! It's so long! It's so... What, Wynn? What dark? Did the lights go out that night? It just lasts forever. She spun around, panicky, her eyes huge with terror. It just goes on and on. How long? How long did the dark last? Wynn tried to... No, she cried. I can't remember. The dark is so long. I can't remember.